So, your living room, anyone? So we'll need people in this area to try to be quiet while the reading's going on. If you need to talk, please feel free to go in the kitchen and get some drinks or refreshments. But if people in this area can try to listen, that'd be great. Thank you. And
I think you'd be allowed to sit on the floor.
Yeah, you can sit on the floor anywhere you need to.
Otherwise, I'll have to cut it really short.
Okay.
Wow. Standing is okay. It's okay. Well, why did I write a book about Helen Ring Robinson, you're wondering? When I presented a resolution celebrating, if you can't hear me, Helen, celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote in Colorado, which of course was in 1893, I presented a resolution to commemorate that. We did it in 92. A year ahead to get started on the celebration. And I learned about the first woman state senator, who was Helen. And she was the second in the country. For a long time people thought she was the first, and a lot of articles even say that. But she was actually the second in the country. But as I learned more about her, the staff did a little research, and I discovered that she and I had led parallel lives. We both came from fairly humble backgrounds. We both became English teachers, and then we both became writers, and then we were both elected to the Senate. We were both Democrats. We both married lawyers. We both lived in Capitol Hill. She lived at 1222 Gaylord, and I'm at 7th and Lafayette. So, you know, we had so many things in common. I felt as if I were her doppelganger, and I thought I would have a lot of understanding of her life. And the other reason is no one has written a biography, a full-length biography of any of these early women legislators. There's some books that cover 3 or 4 of them kind of briefly. A little bit of background about Helen. She was born in Maine, we think. I never could find her birth certificate. She moved early to Providence, Rhode Island. Her father was a laborer, and her sisters worked in the cotton mills, so she came from a humble background. Somehow she became a teacher before she went to Wellesley. She went to Wellesley for 1 year in a program called Teacher Special, and it was for women who were already teachers to help them get a better income from their jobs. She took a very challenging academic program while she was there, including German and Latin and biology, all in 1 year. In 1893, she came to Colorado to teach at Colorado College. She was there for a year, and within a couple of years, she was in Denver teaching at Wolf Hall, an Episcopalian high school. It was called Seminary for girls. And shortly after that, she moved with Anna Walcott to the Miss Walcott School. That building is still there at 13th and Marion. It's now the Walcott Apartments. She married Ewing Robinson in 1902, but within a couple years, he was brought before the Supreme Court on a disbarment charge. And he wasn't actually disbarred, but they said he wasn't completely exonerated either. 3 different clients had complaints against him. Among other things, he foreclosed on a client's house and furniture to pay the bill owed to him, which doesn't seem like a very nice thing to do. Robinson herself, Helen Robinson, has a large body of writing. She wrote for national magazines and the Rocky Mountain News. But there's very little anywhere about Ewing Robinson, and his relationship to Helen is sort of a mystery. So I'm hoping that in the next biography somebody writes about her, they'll reveal all. So how did Helen manage to get elected in 1912? All of you politicians will be interested in this. I think there are 5 factors in her success: the progressive movement, the suffrage movement, women's clubs in Denver, her writing for the Rocky Mountain News, and finally the peculiar election process of 1912. First of all, the progressive movement. They were both progressive Republicans and progressive Democrats, so it gets a little confusing. But in the progressive movement, they believed government should respond to the needs of the poor, and that it needed basic reform. Now, that's not new, is it? The platform called for government to protect ordinary people, protect public lands and resources, control or nationalize railroads, establish an 8-hour workday, and pass recall, initiative, and referendum laws. Helen's extensive speaking for the women's suffrage movement helped her as well. She became a major advocate after she moved to Colorado. She was not convinced up until that time. And Colorado was the first state to grant the vote to women. And the rest of the nation had to wait 27 more years. That's right. The benefit of suffrage for women was not universally appreciated either. I love this quote from Robert S. Morrison of the Colorado Bar Association in 1913. He said, "It has been in operation 16 years, and its effects, whether for the better or the worse, now should and fairly may be soberly considered. It has wrought no drastic changes. It has not affected the result of any contest between the larger political parties, and there's no general concession that its effects have been to the good. It has repealed no legislation inimical to women, because, with one exception, there was no such legislation." The minor exception he was talking about gave women equal rights to their children. Not an insignificant point. And after suffrage passed, women were also immediately elected to the House. 3 women went in 1894. And Helen argued that women had a unique viewpoint that needed to be represented. Helen spoke for women's suffrage in Colorado and nearly every other state in the Union, and spoke at the Great Marble House Conference in Newport, Rhode Island in 1914. And when the federal amendment finally passed in 1920, she wrote a book for women to tell them how to be good voters. After her years in the Senate, she represented the United States in major suffrage conferences in Geneva and Madrid. The third factor that helped Helen get elected was the women's clubs. It's amazing how strong the women's clubs were in Denver. At one time, the Denver Women's Club had 1,000 members. Each of the individual clubs sent a delegate to a council that met in the Capitol, and there was a room devoted to their organization. Between 1909 and 1913, 11 of the 21 bills they endorsed were passed. So they were a real political force. By far the most important club for Helen, though, was the Denver Women's Press Club. And I forgot to mention that I'm also a member of the Denver Women's Press Club, and I was president of the club 100 years after Helen was president. There were many reporters and activists. Oh, here's another elected official, former elected official, Doug Linkhart. And the fourth factor, and the fact that there were so many reporters and writers in the group helped her get elected because they were writing about her. And the fourth factor in her election was her writing a weekly column in the Rocky Mountain News. And it wasn't just a column, sometimes it was a whole page. She did book reviews and features. And she had a kind of folksy style, and people felt as if they knew her. She also wrote a children's adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is now available as an e-book from the Library of Congress. She thought that the children of today needed to know that other forms of slavery still exist. And this is part of her afterword that she wrote there. The boys and girls of today, in the South as in the North, will, as men and women, have to do their part in destroying these other forms of slavery. Every story these children read, which moves their sympathy for the poor and wretched, whether black or white, will help to fit them for the work that lies before them. Every book that teaches them to pity suffering and to hate cruelty will bring nearer the dawn of a new emancipation morning. Such a book, most surely, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. The most important factor in Helen's election, though, was the peculiar nominating and election system of 1912. But this was not Helen's first foray into politics. She helped pass a provision that Denver could form a municipal water district. And she was encouraged because many other women held public office. In fact, she did run for superintendent of instruction in 1910. They had somehow convinced the women that there was one office that was reserved for women. So all the women ran for one office. Naturally, only one woman was elected. But she lost that to a candidate endorsed by the Teachers Association. Another thing that was very important was the primary. The direct primary bill passed in 1910. It passed at the polls. And so it meant that you could go on the ballot by petition. Some of you may have done that at some point. Otherwise, you had to go to the convention, which was controlled by the machine, and typically men, and men appointed or nominated other men. But the petition route opened the offices to many more women. Nevertheless, Helen did go the convention route. She went to the Denver Democratic Convention, and she had to get 10% of the vote to get on the ballot. And of course, we still have a version of this system now. She ran 5th out of the 10 candidates that made it to go on the ballot in September for the primary. And 3 of those candidates would be elected at large from Denver. Denver used to elect all of their legislators at large. I remember the time when we had 17 representatives in the House, all Democrats, because the majority of Denver was Democratic. So even though there were a few Republican strongholds, they had no impact. The next day, Helen was also nominated by a progressive splinter group, a Democratic progressive splinter group, and I don't think she was actually there, because someone had to defend her bona fides as a progressive. But there's no doubt she was if you look at what she sponsored. The Secretary of State stayed open till midnight so everyone could get their petitions in, because everyone in this group had to go on the ballot by petition. This put Helen on the ballot with 2 designations after her name. It said Helen Ring Robinson, Democrat, and citizen, meaning the citizens had petitioned her on. At the national level, you recall in 1912 that the Republicans, under the influence of Teddy Roosevelt, created a new party, the Bull Moose, the Progressive Bull Moose Party. And that same split was carried on down into the state level. So there were 2 Republican parties, a Progressive Party and the regular Republican Party, and that was very helpful for Democrats. The last bit of luck for Helen was that the Denver machine, which Judge Lindsay called the Beast, put out a list of candidates that you should vote for to help keep the machine in power. Come on in. The Rocky Mountain News was furious about this and put out on the front page what was really an editorial, a huge story about how terrible this had been, that the machine was trying to control the primary. And then a little later, the Rocky Mountain News put out a list of who were the good guys that you should vote for. Helen was very lucky. She wasn't on the machine list, and they were scrambling to get off of it, everyone who was named, and she was on the good guys list. So as a result of the Republican division, the November election was a Democratic landslide. Helen won. Helen, in fact, ran first, ahead of all others. She received 24,836 votes. Next were Joseph Berry and Reuben Morris, the other 2 regular Democratic candidates. So those 3 Democrats were elected from Denver. The next highest 3 were the Progressive Bull Moose Party Republicans. The numbers in the Senate were terrific for the Democrats, 21 to 11. How would you like that? Yeah. I'm very aware of that because I was the 11th Democrat when I went in, and there were 24 Republicans. In the House, 52 to 13. And of course, the governor's office was won by Democrat Elias Ammons. So what did Helen do in her first year in the Senate with a Democratic majority? She announced her objective was to be the housewife of the Senate. She was rightfully proud of the competence of most housewives. She said, "I am going to be the housewife of the Senate. There'll be so many men there that I shall let them look after themselves, and I shall take it upon myself to look after the women and children. I wish to be a spokeswoman of the women and children in Colorado in the legislature, and I shall feel honored to introduce any laws drawn up for their welfare and protection. I believe a woman who is qualified as a capable mother and housewife can qualify as a capable legislator. I hold my new responsibilities to the people of the state as sacred as I hold my responsibilities to my husband and my daughter. And later, Helen described how the men received her. At first, they were conscious of the fact that one of their members was a woman. But in a short time, they forgot all about that and treated me as one of themselves, and I considered it a compliment. The only difference I remarked was that they did remove their hats and cigars when speaking to me. Of course, they were smoking on the floor in that era. There was smoking even when I was there. I sat beside a smoker, in front of a smoker, on the side all the time. When the Senate organized, all the committee chairs, of course, were like Helen, Democrats. And Helen got the plum appointment of chair of the Education Committee, Education Institutions Committee. And she also served on 3 other committees. Somebody's phone?
Sorry, that's my phone. Sorry.
And she also chaired something called the Special Interim Committee on Institutions and Education. Well, it was institutions, but that included educational institutions. Their job was simply go around the state, visit every institution, including the prison, the home for neglected and dependent children, every higher ed institution, and determine their needs for the next 20 years. Wow. Oh! Well, they said, what a luxury. We can't do that. We'll do it for 2 years. So that's what they did. It's a kind of a combination of the Joint Budget Committee and the Capital Development Committee now. Early in the first session, Helen established herself as a force to be reckoned with when she defended women against charges of Senator John Hecker. Hecker contended that women in Denver drink more highballs than men. According to a report in a Washington paper, Senator Hecker tried to explain that the press had misquoted him. He had been speaking of the women of Washington. But he didn't have the good judgment to stop there. He added that while he had not made any such statement heretofore, he was willing to father it and would bring proof if anyone wished. He said, 20 women to 1 man in Denver drink intoxicating liquor, and they drink more than men. Helen's riposte on personal privilege was a devastating personal attack, more cutting than any I heard in my 12 years in the Senate. This is what she said. Mr. President, when I hear a person with vain mouthings multiplying 0 by 0, I pay no attention to his babblings. And as I turn away from such futilities, Mr. President, without hearing them, so even more surely do I close my ears to all disagreeable, discordant noises of life, when their hearing can do me or others no possible good. I say this in explanation of the fact, Mr. President, that ever since my first week in the Senate chamber, I have heard practically no single syllable of all the various noises which have been hurled from desk 31, where sits the senator from the first. When he has begun to speak, Mr. President, I have discussed parliamentary procedure with my native to the right, or I have answered the letter of a constituent, read a bill that was on the calendar, or indulged in some other profitable business. I take the first opportunity as a reckless, which presents itself, to denounce it publicly as a reckless and infamous statement, made in utter disregard of the truth and common decency. It may indeed be that in the street of forbidden things, in the red purlieus of lost souls and ruined bodies, that here prostitute women do indeed drink more coffee and highballs than even the prostitute men, their companions. If the senator garners his information from the murk and slime of such places, he has no right to spread such information over the records of this honorable body. It is a means of libeling my sisters and your wives and daughters. The women of Colorado need no defenses from me, and I protest that the women of Colorado are surpassed by none in all true womanly qualities, and that many of them have, in addition, a breadth of vision, a range of sympathies far less general among their sisters of Europe or their sisters of the East. The result, I believe, Mr. President, of that equality of citizenship, which has been theirs for nearly 20 years. After that, it was clear that no attack on women would go unanswered. As long as Mrs. Robinson was in the Senate. They called her Senator Mrs. Robinson.
Senator Mrs. Robinson.
Because there was another Robinson, a man. So just to distinguish them, she was Senator Mrs. Robinson. So what bills did she sponsor in her first year? She authored several bills to fight prostitution, which was then euphemistically called the social evil. Denver's first policewoman, Josephine Roche, surveyed the prostitutions and found that 50% of them were driven to prostitution by economic necessity. Some were just tired and worn out. Helen said that, quote, "The social evil lies at the door of all of us who consent to women being paid less than they can decently live on. Any industry that doesn't pay women a living wage is a parasitical industry on the social body. And the social evil can never be eradicated by stoning or segregation, but through the paying of a living wage." Many women and girls in Denver were paid as little as $4 a week. And if they complained to their employers, the employers would make insulting innuendos about they should get money, good-looking girls should get money from their gentleman friends. Helen's most successful bill to fight prostitution set up a system for establishing a minimum wage for women. While she was creating the bill, she met with business girls and women at the YMCA. A letter to her from Judge Ben Lindsay in January made it clear that he was the major architect of the bill. He studied the Wisconsin and Massachusetts bills, just like we do now, and he said the Massachusetts version was just about as good a law as we can well propose at this time. Senate Bill 147 provided for a wage commission of 3, including at least one woman, to investigate working conditions and determine minimum wages for women and minor employees in each industry. Helen got tired of the fact the bill wasn't heard. It was kept in the committee for a long time. And she said she was tired of women crowding into the Senate trying to find out if the bill passed yet. And they meant, when they said crowding in, they meant crowding in because the public, the press, and the lobbyists were all on the floor of the Senate. It passed out of the Senate on March 6th, but it gained the opposition of at least 5 of Denver's department stores. They wanted one statewide minimum wage, which they figured would be lower than one set just for Denver. In the House, the bill was in trouble. The Senate Democrats were unhappy because there was a woman's Republican sponsor in the House. Of course, there were only 2 women, so they didn't have a lot of choice in the House. Finally, Helen's minimum wage bill passed the House and Senate the day before adjournment, April 14th. And as he considered signing the bill, the governor met with department stores. And he promised to meet with working women. He signed the bill May 14th, just within the 30 days allowed. Helen also believed that women should be able to sit on juries. She was encouraged in that by Judge Lindsay as well. And he had asked Agnes Riddle to sponsor it in the House and Helen in the Senate. Senate Bill 52 would have permitted 3/4, as opposed to all of a jury, to find a verdict in civil cases, and took a very modern view of the criminally insane, saying they were not to be tried unless and until they regained their sanity. And it also provided for a 13th alternate juror. On the first vote, January 31st, the bill lost by 1 vote, 23 to 11. And then it was reconsidered and it lost by more votes. And all 3 of her bills lost. She was way ahead of her time, because women could not sit on juries in Colorado until 1944.
Wow.
Helen had several bills on education. In that era, some school districts only provided 2 months of free public education because they ran out of money. 2 months, and that was it. So she was the Senate sponsor of a House bill that required 6 months of education and $50 a month to each to the teachers. And they also provided some money for the districts to pay that. She had several bills on education, and as promised, she had tried to improve the lives of women. But she also fought to guarantee men minimum wages, to protect neglected children, and for better care for the mentally ill. In all, Helen sponsored 27 bills. That's a little more than the 5-bill limit. 5 of them passed. But 2 were vetoed by the governor. He was very parsimonious, and they had appropriations on them. One was for the home for neglected children. How he could veto that, I don't know. And the other was for traveling libraries. Helen's most important effort, though, was changing the image of a senator. She told a story about being in a hotel in New York and receiving a telegram under the door addressed to Senator H.R. Robinson. And the bellhop had scrawled on it, "Paged in bar and barber shop." But she wasn't there. He had a very conventional view of what a senator should look like. Well, that's just the first 3 chapters of the book. And then the last 3 chapters have some interesting stories, too. There's the story of the Ludlow Massacre. Helen was very supportive of the mining families. And then after 11 women and children were burned because the Colorado National Guard set fire to her tent city, 1,000 women massed at the Capitol, and she was a leader of those women and spoke to them several times. And they forced the governor to telegram Woodrow Wilson and ask for help from the Army. It was only the Army that established peace in Colorado. Then there was the silly 20th General Assembly. And this is one for the record books. There was a fist fight on the floor of the House. A legislator, Arterell, socked the editor of the Denver Express because he had written many critical articles about it. And instead of having Arterell arrested, they arrested the editor and called him to the bar the next day and reprimanded him for sitting in the representative's chair. So you see, it is really a bad thing to do that. And then another thing that happened is there was some money exchanged on the floor, a big wad of money. Representative Helen was giving it to it was to go to a woman detective who was to get something on Judge Ben Lindsay, and they in fact tried to find some kind of immoral activity on the part of Judge Lindsay. But unfortunately, Representative Helen had told one story to a court and another story to someone else, and so he was prosecuted for perjury and expelled from the House the next day after the charges were filed. And finally, after Helen was out of the Senate, she was a peace activist first. She went on Henry Ford's peace ship to Europe, and their idea, World War I was already underway, but their idea was that somehow they would get the neutral nations to mediate between the belligerent nations and stop the war. That didn't work. But it was quite an interesting effort. And Henry Ford paid for their passage on the ship. After the U.S. got into the war, she was a big seller of war bonds. In fact, she said that the effort to sell those bonds were what led to her demise in 1923 when she was dying. She died in July of 1923, and her husband, Ewing, who's a man of mystery, really, decided on a way to save some money. He didn't bury her for about 6 months. She was cremated. I'm sure he had it earned. I guess it was 9 months. And then he decided, well, I will use the backside of the same tombstone I used for my first wife. So one side of the tomb, she's at Fairmont, and one side says, Cora Ballard, wife of Ewing Robinson with the big Robinson at the bottom. The other side says simply, Helen Ring Robinson, 1923, I followed the gleam. Nothing about Ewing or anything. And I do have a picture of the tombstone. I have both sides, but it's very hard to see unless you're really close.
In Riverside
Where is
Cemetery?
this?
No, Fairmont.
I gotta go. We gotta go. Let's go to field trip.
Well, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about her or the process of doing this.
Pat, as a granddaughter of a suffragist from Oregon, I want to thank you for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. We don't know these people well enough, which is really why.
It was just amazing. We went to when I was a child, we went to a few meetings that the other suffragists would have on election day. And we met senators, U.S. senators and people like that. It was just amazing. But thank you so much for doing it.
I think this is some suggestion that we're supposed to
Yeah. I was going to say.
sell these books. I have a few books. The pricing is
$37.60.
$37.65, and I can't take credit cards because I don't know how to process them.
Let me say,
on how she responded to him when they met in heaven, and about how cheap he was about the tombstone.
I don't know if anyone else ever did that, but it's shocking to me. I mean, so there's a body on one side and then there's an urn on the other side somewhere, presumably.
And you can't spring for another tombstone. I mean, come on.
Well, he may have been ill. They were living apart at the end of her life. At various times they had different addresses, and I just really don't know.
Okay.
And he wasn't buried there. I mean, it would have been difficult. I mean, how do you decide where to put him? So he's buried in Ohio, where he came from.
Did you say she only served 1 year?
Well, her first year, she was in a Democratic majority, but she served 4 years.
Oh, she served 4
But
years.
in those days, the legislature only met in odd years. So the regular sessions were 1913, 1915, 1917, 1919. But in 1914, they had a special session, of course, because of the Ludlow massacre. So she was in 3 sessions, but by 1915, the whole political atmosphere had changed dramatically. The Republicans were in charge of everything, both houses and the governor's
Did
office.
she get defeated then, or did she voluntarily?
She didn't run again.
She didn't run again.
I'm wondering, in that 1914 special session, what did they do about the Ludlow massacre? Was it just requesting the U.S. Army to come in?
They did get the Army to come in. They had to pay for the National Guard that had killed the women and the children. They had to have an appropriation to pay for that. They had a law to allow the governor to prohibit the sale of liquor in the times of riot, and also a law against guns, selling guns in the time of unrest. And the governor could just declare it. And really what they needed was a way to resolve strikes. But the governor argued that they had to first have a constitutional amendment to give them the power to do that. And they argued they didn't need that. But the call was limited in such a way that they could not do a bill to require a mediation or arbitration to end strikes. So the real problem was, how do you end a strike?
Pat, did Mother Jones come then? Was she there?
Yes, yes, she did come, and she was in prison. And that was one of the reasons they massed at the Capitol, because they were outraged that Mother Jones had been put into prison or jail. But it was a really shocking, controlled by the mine owners of all of that part of Colorado, including the system of justice, the police, the sheriffs, the courts. It's just really very thorough. And Helen wrote a long article about it for The Independent, which was a national labor newspaper. An interesting article. She went down there before the Ludlow massacre. She was interested in their conditions. She was quite amazing. Yes.
Did she serve as a flag bearer, so other women ran for the legislature afterwards, or was a long time before other women.
Well, one was elected the next term, and that was Empress Wheeler. She moved from the House to the Senate, and then there wasn't any woman in the Senate until about 1940s. Yeah. So it was really a long. When I went in the Senate, there were 7 women in '88. How many are there now?
17.
17?
17 out of 35.
That's great. We're making progress. When I presented the resolution, I dressed up as Helen Robinson. And I said, you know, I was returning to the Senate. And I told them at the rate they were going, it would take till 2050 for women to take over. But I think you just need one more.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm sorry you had to stand.
I've enjoyed reading the first couple of chapters. I did it last night because I want to come prepared a little bit. And really your writing is so easy to follow and just exciting. She really did come alive. Thank you. It's very good. If you haven't bought the book, I suggest you do.